I was having this conversation recently that if I could distill down to a question, would be something like how much of the existing housing shortage is down to exclusionary zoning? And the way I'd answer that is yes, just not in the way that you're probably thinking. But in that conversation, it also occurred to me that a lot of people conflate affordable housing with apartments.
Wait, hold on. Wait. Let's back it up. So, it's Thanksgiving weekend, and you can see that fall is just about over. When I got here a few days ago, there were a lot more leaves on the trees, but it rained, and then it was really windy, so things are really over at this point. But it's an interesting concept. When I was in Australia, some people would take issue with the idea of fall, but I would say that autumn and fall are not really the same thing. Fall is like a 4-week period that may or may not entirely be within autumn. Like if you're in Vermont, fall starts when it's still summer. It starts like mid to late September. And if you're where I live, there's not really a fall at all. But what there is really happens in the winter. Anyway. It is really cold out here. And I'm also underdressed. I don't have the winter gear that I used to. So you'll have to pardon my shivering. Anyway, I was saying earlier that I used to have like a whole winter, or I had at least 3 pairs of pants that had like flannel lining on the inside, super warm. I would have never gone outside on a day like this without wearing them. Yeah, I don't know why it seems like people are intentionally misunderstanding zoning. Because a lot of the debate around zoning, what people are actually talking about isn't zoning, it's land use. People are conflating these two concepts. And I know this might sound like a semantic argument, but I think it's an important one. I think taking it back a few steps might be helpful. So, lots of states require local governments to have a comprehensive plan, usually by state statute. So, states like California, North Carolina, Colorado, Florida, etc. require comprehensive planning by state statute. And there are other states like Georgia that don't require it, but they incentivize it in such a way that almost every county in the state has one. And comprehensive plan is typically going to have a bunch of different elements to it. And they'll be laid out in the forms of goals, objectives, and policies. And, you might have like a transportation element. You'll have a land use element. You might have a separate infrastructure element for things like sewer and water. The priorities are vary from place to place, which is the whole point of having the comp plan in the first place. But it's that land use element in the comprehensive plan that sort of lays out the vision for what the community is going to look like over the long term. All right, it's December, Jim here. I'm back home, and I'm just trying to re-record a portion of this because most of what I filmed in New Jersey was super windy, and there's no way to get the wind noise out of the audio, and I don't want to put you guys through that. It sounded pretty rough, but man, now that I'm out here, it's a little breezy too, and I'm going to try to be as faithful to the original as possible, but I am just kind of winging it here. Most places are going to have some kind of comprehensive plan, and then within that, they're going to have some kind of land use element, and then part of that land use element is going to be a land use map. And
in the land use element, it'll describe in words what each land use category is. So it'll describe industrial, it'll describe residential, it'll describe commercial, it'll describe mixed use. And then the map is going to show you where in the county all of those things belong, as a matter of policy. So again, I'm not saying I agree with the separation of uses. I'm just explaining how the process works now, because if it's something that you're looking to fix, and fix efficiently, it's important to understand how it works. And it's also important to understand how the law works, because while it may seem like a matter of semantics, like that's what most of the law is. Most places have something like this. Like in Calgary, I think it's called the land use bylaw map. And if you're in California, it's going to be part of the general plan. In Australia, you're going to have the planning scheme, but it's basically all the same. Those land uses are going to be commercial, industrial, residential, institutional, so like schools, hospitals, that sort of thing. You probably have a recreation land use in there as well. You might have natural or agricultural. There's all kinds of different, depending on the context of your community, there's all kinds of different land use categories. Typically within each of those land uses, each of those future land uses, there will be compatible zoning categories. So, the land use is telling you what you can do, so commercial, residential, industrial. And then the zoning is telling you how you can do that thing within that land use. Also within those land use categories, a lot of places do have them separate, but they don't have to be. There are plenty of places that have some kind of mixed use category, and theoretically it would be possible to expand that to most of your city. I wouldn't necessarily want to do away with it entirely. Like, I don't know if you'd want a downtown power plant, but it's important to consider those things, and then organize your comprehensive plan accordingly. So, but anyway, it's this land use map that a lot of people are actually referring to when they're talking about quote unquote Euclidean zoning, and which is actually kind of funny to me, because if you look at the old code from Euclid, Ohio, back in the 20s, it's actually really elegant, and it doesn't really define a strict separation of uses, because there are lots of categories that they have in there that are mixed use. What it's really defining is intensity, and it's like a layered intensity, because they'll describe uses, but then on top of that, they also describe height and bulk. So it was kind of like a mix of both, a mix of land use and a mix of zoning. But it's not really like, when a lot of people talk about what a mixed use code should look like, it looks a lot like what Euclid's old code was. What Euclid was doing was saying, like, yeah, we can have a traditional downtown, and we can still have some quiet residential streets, but the industry is going to be over on the other side of town, and we're not going to be dominated by factories. So the whole point of comprehensive planning is really that the states are doing population forecasting, and it's called the Bieber Index, and it's like the Bureau of Economic and Business Research or something like that. It's based out of the University of Florida, and
you can go back to the 1970s and then look at the numbers that they were quoting for like 2000 or 2010 back in 1970, and they are like spot on. It's amazing. So the states are coming up with these numbers, and then they're telling the cities and the counties like, hey, this is how many people you're going to have in 10 years, 20 years, 40 years. You need to plan accordingly. The comp plan is based on those population projections. The cities and the counties are essentially trying to figure out like, hey, this is how many people we're going to have in 30 years. So this is how many units of housing we're going to need in 30 years. So, how are we going to plan for that housing? How are we going to plan our transportation infrastructure, our sewer and water, et cetera, et cetera. So in California, that's mostly done through the RHNA process, the Regional Housing Needs Assessment. And so basically the state sends the numbers to the MPO for each metropolitan area. That's the Metropolitan Planning Organization. And then from there, they divvy it up amongst they divvy up the housing allocation amongst the counties based on the individual projections. And then from there, they get further divvied up between the cities. So basically, everybody's supposed to be taking their fair share, but that's not at all what happens quite clearly. So we're talking about land use and the difference between land use and zoning. And so your land use categories are going to be broad: residential, commercial, industrial. So as an example, within a commercial future land use, you may have, let's say, C1, C2, and C3 zoning. And C1 zoning is going to allow for, let's say, a neighborhood hardware store. Within that C1 zoning, you may have specific uses that are permitted, right? So not really a use per se, but like how that use can be conducted. So let's compare like a neighborhood hardware store to a Home Depot. So C1 is probably going to permit a neighborhood hardware store. And the zoning code might not say that literally, but because you're only allowed a certain square footage, you have a maximum lot size, there may be other considerations like setbacks or curb cuts that you may or may not be allowed to have. You're only going to be able to have that hardware store. But if you want to run a Home Depot or a Bunnings, if you're in Australia, you're going to need a larger site. You're going to need larger turning radii because your deliveries are going to be coming more often and in bigger trucks. So you're going to probably need to look for like a C3 type of zoning. And the point is that different types of development have different infrastructure considerations. So even if you're looking at residential and you're looking at medium residential for townhomes compared to high density residential for 50 to 100 dwelling units an acre, you're probably talking like 6 to 8 story buildings, larger apartment block type buildings, because your transportation demand, your travel demand is going to be different, and your sewer and water is going to be different. It's going to be more intense, and so your streets, your transit, your roads in general are going to need to be planned differently, and your underground infrastructure will also need to reflect that.
So when I was in Winter Park yesterday, my intention was to go by a few different hardware stores in the area, just to sort of give a sense of the difference between how they got to look like that, and what the zoning was that was dictating that form. So I got to Miller's and I'm looking at it and I'm thinking, I'm just thinking of the other codes that I've worked on. So I got there and I'm thinking to myself, and I said out loud,
but I'm guessing that this is C2 zoning.
But I had actually never looked at the code for Winter Park before. And so when I got home, I did. And it turns out that this is their version of C3. And it's more interesting to see how their land development code is written. And, they do have a future land use map. They're required to by state law. But they don't and I haven't read the whole thing, but it looks like, at least for their commercial districts, that all of their commercial districts are mixed use. And it is, it's a large part of the town. But what I found interesting was, so it shows you what their permitted uses are: retail, funeral homes, business, financial, medical, professional. It allows off-street parking, blueprinting, photocopying. That's funny to me. So clearly, like, this is an older code. And then it spells out some conditional uses. So things that would be allowed, but only with a certain suite of special conditions to go along with them. So restaurants. So I think usually when you see conditional use for a restaurant, it's usually about hours of operation. They want you to be closed by 10 p.m., 11 p.m., something like that. Office, showroom, drive-ins, buildings over 10,000 square feet. And this, if you know Winter Park, this kind of makes sense because it is like a smaller town. And I think they're trying to ward off the Barnes and Noble of yore, and some of the bigger footprint stores. It's also interesting how the development standards are in the same section as the zoning category itself. I haven't really seen a lot of that. It's talking about setbacks, but here's where it gets interesting to me, is when they talk about FAR. So they're saying that the floor area ratio is another way of it. Interesting for many reasons, because normally if someone's saying floor area ratio and they want to say that you can cover 45% of the lot, it's two different ways to say the same thing, but they're saying it both in the same sentence. So if you wanted to say your building lot coverage shall be 45%, then you would say that your FAR is 0.45. And anyway, but that means that, like, your building can only take up 45% of the lot. So if you had a 2-story building, that means that you can only take up 22.5% of the lot, right? Because it's the combined floor area. So the taller your building gets, the smaller the portion of the lot it can take up. It is interesting here because it doesn't allow you to have a residential only building. If you're going to have residential units, you have to have a business on the ground floor. But it also allows for a bonus FAR up to, I think I read in here, 60%. But it also imposes a 3-story height limit, which is crazy because even if you have a 0.6 FAR, oh yeah, here it is. Floor area ratio of the project may be up to 60% FAR. But so even if you have that 0.6 FAR and you have a 3-story building, then you're only covering, it's less than a third of the lot. Like, what are you going to do with the rest of that space? Parking? I don't. It's hard to understand what the intent of that is. Yeah, I don't know. I don't get it. Because it's not even like, so their max impervious surface ratio is 85%. 15% of the development has to be in the form of green space. So like a grass or some other kind of vegetative covering. And the point of that is that, the more runoff you have from your site, the heavier burden that is on the stormwater system, and the higher likelihood of flooding. And I think I read somewhere else in this code that they need to handle the first inch of rain on site before there's any runoff from the site. That's not uncommon around here. It's also not uncommon to have an inch of rain in an hour. It's pretty much like every evening in the summer here. That was an interesting bit of Winter Park, but something else that I found interesting was in Brisbane. Brisbane doesn't have a future land use map as I've been describing it, They do have a zoning map, and I was trying to find the performance standards or like some sort of land development code in there, and I could not find it. I'm sure if I keep digging, I will. But I thought that this use table was interesting because it's only for the residential districts, and it kind of in the left hand column here, it tells you what zone it's relevant to, and then whether or not granny flats are allowed, rooming accommodation. I don't. I'm guessing that means short-term rental. I don't know. And then duplexes, and then townhomes or row homes. So you can see that those things are permitted in a whole bunch of different categories. So they've got low medium residential, LMR2, LMR3. I'm guessing that these are steps up in density, because then it continues on to MDR and HDR, which are, it's funny because these are super common descriptions like LMDR and MDR in the US. So if you compare that to this use table, it's very similar in layout and intent, right? The only thing is it's turned sideways. So the zoning districts are going across the top here, and it gets more intense as you go to the right. So, your T62, T63 in your urban core, and then, T2 would be in the rural zone. And these transects come straight out of new urbanism. But in any case, you can see the permitted uses in each one, in each zone. So by the time you get to like 4.3, which would be as your slightly more dense suburban neighborhoods, most uses are permitted, most residential uses anyway. And then you start to get into the more commercial uses. And then by the time you get to 5.1, most commercial uses are permitted. With the actual standards for zoning, right? You've got your more suburban stuff here. This would be the 3.3 transect, so slightly more dense suburbia. And then, so we get to, here we go, 4.3. So these are the zoning standards, right? Like your minimum lot width is 16 feet, which is what you would need for a townhouse. You can cover up to 70% of the lot. Your impervious surface can be up to 80%. And frontage occupation at 60%. That means that 60% of the primary building has to be on the build to line or the setback, if you want to call it that. So you need, like, when you think about when you're walking down a main street and it's just one building after another, that's basically 100% frontage occupation. So here they're saying it has to be 60%. It's telling you what your setbacks are. If there are other structures on the property, then it's telling you what the rules are for that. But this is the form that zoning code yields, right? So saying that you want to get rid of zoning would basically be like saying, we don't care what you build or what it looks like, just go ahead, whatever. Like you need zoning, right? It doesn't necessarily need to separate most uses, but you still need it, and everywhere in the developed world uses some form of zoning. And just for S's and G's, we can go up to 5.2 here, and you can see that frontage occupation go up to 70%, and the impervious surface goes up to 100%, with 80% max lot coverage, and that's for the building, right? So parking would be in addition to that. So theoretically you could have a building taking up 80% of the lot, and then the other 20% is for loading. Okay, I digress. I know a lot of places don't have land use planning, or they don't have comprehensive planning, and so therefore they wouldn't necessarily have a land use map, or maybe they do have comp planning and they kind of blend the concepts of land use and zoning into one map, and then maybe even more places don't address it at all. But that's something different from it not existing at all. The concept's been around for a long time, at least 30 years. And I mean, even going back 7 years ago, there's this article in Strong Towns that I have up right now, and this is funny for a couple of reasons. One, because it addresses the concept of land use. It calls out Euclidean zoning, and it goes on to basically describe a slightly more complicated version of Euclid's zoning code from the 1920s. I mean, like, this chart here is just like Euclid times 4. It's the same concepts. It's just packaged slightly differently. It's a little bit more complex, I guess. But it's not different, and it's this concept of cumulative zoning, so that, like, you start with the lowest intensity use, and then as you go up in intensity, these other uses are allowed, but then the uses below it are also allowed. So in theory, you could wind up with single family housing in an industrial, like an intense industrial district. I mean, why anyone would do that, I don't know, but it's legally permitted. That has its own kind of problems, right? Like, it's already allowed in a lot of places, and it generally doesn't happen. And when it does happen, it's usually the lowest value housing, essentially slum housing. Like, there are really good reasons, going back to Jacob Riis and his work, like, why we don't allow that anymore. All right, so going out to California for a minute, Ventura County, they've got their general plan. You can see their land use designations and standards. You can see they have their goals, objectives, and policies here. Their goal for land use is to promote the effective implementation and use of the general plan land use diagram. And this is their whole land use element here. It looks a lot like what I've worked with on the East Coast. If we click in, you can see their compatibility matrix. So they have their land use categories on the left-hand side, going top to bottom here. And then going across on the right are their zoning categories. So you can see how different zoning categories are permitted in different land use districts. You can also see that they do have a mixed use district, but apparently 2 zoning districts that are permitted in mixed use. That's pretty cool. If we look at the city of Ventura in Ventura County, and looking at their mixed use zone, which I'm guessing this is most of their downtown area, it tells you what the permitted uses are, residential, and this is not the mixed use land use. This is the mixed use zoning district. So they would likely have a mixed use future land use, and then within that they would have a mixed use zoning category. So this is spelling that out. So permitted uses: residential, multifamily, residential care. That's usually means like assisted living. Residential condominiums. That's kind of weird because a condo describes a type of ownership. It doesn't describe a building type. Like any kind of house, like, or apartment could be condo in theory. And this is running through like all of the business and commercial uses that are permitted, which is like everything that you would expect to have in a downtown. Personal storage is kind of weird. I don't know if I would want to see self-storage in a downtown near me, like maybe on the edge of downtown in like a light industrial area. It's usually where you want to stick those things. Agricultural, none. That's interesting. And then they have a whole bunch of uses where they require a use permit. So it's usually because they're putting special conditions on whatever that use is. And so under residential, it's only a group home where they would have a permit. And that's probably for stuff like hours of operation, like curfew type of thing. I don't know. Anyway, daycare, group care, fast service, drive-throughs. Yeah, I could see that. Definitely want to curtail hours of operation for that, or just not allow drive-throughs in your downtown anyway. They kind of don't really belong and kind of mess up the fabric. This was interesting that uses listed in sections 24.244 blah blah must also comply with the following special provisions. Plan development permit. Approval of a PD permit or amendment pursuant to Chapter 24 is required for any construction of new structures or additions or alterations to existing structures in conjunction with or in any way related to the use types listed in sections 24, except for recycling services. That's weird. Usually, like, when I see that a place allows PDs or requires them, to me that means that their code is garbage and they know it. And the only way that anyone can build anything is with a PD, and that plan development application is basically like, it's a whole separate set of standards that apply only to that development, and it's like a contract between the city and the builder or any future builder related to that piece of land. And it basically becomes an ordinance. It's like its own separate little planning category. I don't know when they really took off in popularity, but most of them that I see are from the 80s and 90s. And so, yeah, it could be because a place has just a total shit code and they don't have the money to write a new one. And so they just use PDs to get everything done. Or it's a kind of soft corruption, like influence peddling. Or I don't know. It's like influence peddling under the guise of constituent services. So like rather than having a city decide what they want their city to look like, everything has to go through the commission. Has to be reviewed by the electeds before it gets approved, which just, it corrupts the process, right? Like, just decide what you want things to look like, put it in writing, make it fair and transparent, and call it a day. If someone wants to deviate from the code that you've written, then they come to the commission. Then the electeds get to thumbs up or thumbs down. But to make people go through the PD process and then, beg the commission, especially like the district commissioners, for approval, that's a place I don't want to work. So here we go. The density standards. For buildings and lots in the MXD zone not used exclusively for residential purposes, there is no general lot area, lot width, or lot coverage standards. That is pretty cool. And then it says that if the building is exclusively residential, then the standards for the R3 zone apply. Yeah, that's the other thing I forgot to mention, that usually density is tied to the land use. Like, so the land use categories and the land use map will show what the densities are for each district. And then the zoning is describing the intensity. So like how much of the land can be built on, how tall the buildings can be. So anyway, if we click here on 24.305, so it's giving us the standards. Oh yeah, here it is. Okay. So, it's saying the low moderate density row house overlay zone is intended for small lots, 14.1 to 20 dwelling units per acre. It also allows for duplex, triplex, quads, and then building types, single family, duplex, triplex, row house. Yep. Building placement, telling you a 10-foot minimum setback. 20-foot max, so it's giving you a little bit of wiggle room, but it's still establishing a maximum setback, so you can't be any further back than 20 feet. A lot of places will use a build to line, so a setback means you have to be behind it. So if it's a 10-foot setback, then you could be 10 feet, you could be 12 feet, you could be 15, you could be 20. But if it's a build to line and that build to line is 5 feet, then you have to be on that 5-foot line. There is no wiggle room. and this was kind of like, if you walk through a city like Philadelphia or Brooklyn, this is kind of de facto a 5 foot build to line. Like all of the houses are at the same distance from the curb, and then, but you know, they're actually 5 foot back from the right of way because the staircase comes out and meets the right of way. So sometimes the bigger homes that have bigger staircases, it could be a 10 foot build to line. Yeah, maximum parking frontage. So, so this is kind of like talking about a frontage occupation, but backwards. So this is like a 70% frontage occupation, but they're calling it a 30% parking frontage. It's a weird orientation. But I don't. Yeah, this is street side, so it's, okay, whatever. So, yeah, land use designation, general development standards, and this is very familiar looking to me, even though I've never been I've been through Ventura County, but I've never looked at their land development code or their comp plan before. So they're saying in the rural area, it's 1 dwelling unit per 2 acres. In the ag areas, it's 1 dwelling unit per 40 acres. And then it basically means like, if you want to have a house, you need to have 40 acres. And then for open space, it doesn't matter. Like the minimum sizes are 10 or 20 acres, but it doesn't matter how big it is, that only one house can be on that parcel. And then for their residential designations, they're saying 4 dwelling units an acre, and then saying that the minimum lot size is 10,000 square feet, which is different places look at this differently. Some places will use gross, and other places will use net. But if you have 4 lots that are 10,000 square feet, then you're just under an acre. But also, you need room for access. So you're going to lose square footage to the street in front of the houses. So it basically winds up being an acre. So maybe they are using gross. But in any case, right, these are the land use categories, not the zoning. And it's telling you what the density can be, the max densities can be in each one. And then also interesting that they also talk about FAR in their mixed use commercial and industrial districts, but not in the residential districts. Very interesting. And yet, what do they do about stormwater? It's kind of wild. I mean, I know it rains there. I've seen the flooding on the news. Yeah. You got to wonder, you have whole residential neighborhoods that are like 80 or 90% impervious. You get a half inch of rain and that's just total chaos. That water is not going anywhere but running down the street and then into the nearest gully. Yeah, that's a lot.
Well, thanks for joining me. I really wanted to get into a little bit of detail, or at least start a conversation on the difference between land use and zoning before I get into talking about exclusionary zoning, because that is the difference between use and zoning, right? So you can allow for a residential use, and your land use map might say low density residential, medium density, high density, those sort of land use categories. But your zoning will dictate the minimum lot size, the setbacks, the height. So you can use either category to restrict housing to a certain type. So if you require a 15-foot setback or a 10-foot setback or a 5-foot setback, then you can't have townhomes. If your minimum lot size is 7,000 square feet, then you're kind of jacking up the price of housing artificially by making everyone have a big lot. Over these next couple of videos, I'm going to be diving a little bit deeper into that topic because a couple months ago, I had this conversation with a colleague, and the gist of it was how much of the housing crisis has been caused by exclusionary zoning. And then back in September, I was in Tampa, and there was a talk on inclusionary zoning, which, you know, you would think would be the opposite of exclusionary zoning. So I signed up for it. I went, got about 10 minutes into the talk, and I was thinking to myself, what the hell are these people talking about? They're not talking about zoning at all. They're talking about incentives for subsidized housing. And that's not what zoning is. So, got a bit more to say about that. I'll see you next time. I'm Jim. This is Urban Legends. Thanks for joining me. And so, on the topic of zoning and land use, you can't really see it from here, but just behind me, maybe about 100 meters, is the Patco line running into Philadelphia. So it's like transit-oriented nature. There goes the train.